Good evening. It was only just months ago that it looked like the Kremlin might succeed in hijacking another European election, as we saw in Georgia, unfortunately, and as it attempted to do in Moldova. Fortunately, the Moldovans pulled through. But tonight we have the Romanian elections, and there was a resounding victory for the pro European candidate that opposes Russia influence. And they give some sort of a background to that so you understand the importance of these elections. Let's look at what just happened. It was certainly a matter of months ago when they had the initial elections. So a guy named Calin Georgescu, who was virtually unknown, nobody had heard of him a year before, he shocked everybody in the first round. He got 23% of the vote. Everyone said, how's that possible? How's a guy who literally nobody knows who he is, they're Googling his name the day after the elections, how could he possibly win the first round? And it wasn't due to the fact that he had great grassroots or a party infrastructure. He had neither of those. What he had was TikTok. He had a lot of TikTok. So TikTok, specifically algorithm-driven content on TikTok, was amplifying his message. And he had his own paid influencers and others, but it was mostly just TikTok. And it gained traction, especially among young voters. But what investigators found in the coming weeks and months was that this love for him by TikTok was not organic. This momentum did not build by itself. It was built by engineers who specifically worked to make sure that his influence used the right algorithms to build and drive narratives that encourage millions of Romanians, especially the young ones, to vote for him. And that was a viral success, a huge success. And that would actually be fine. There's nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that Romanian intelligence discovered something else. It wasn't simply that he had great TikTok, that had great smart guys knowing how to do good TikTok. It was that there was foreign interference. There was foreign benefit. In fact, there's entire disinformation networks that were pushing his material. And there is, of course, the hand of Russia behind this to influence the elections. And that's why the Constitutional Court nullified those results. And they said that simply illegal outside funding or external influence gets you thrown out of elections. So after Georgescu got thrown out, more came to the surface. So one of his bodyguards, a guy named Horacio Potra, became famous because he was convicted earlier in his life of being an extremist. Well, it was found out, sure enough, he had tons of cash at his house, which he had no clear explanation of where that cash came from. It came from Russia. But he had no clear explanation for where this cash come from. But there are photos that show that he had been to Russia, he'd been to Moscow, and that he had been meeting with Russians during this period of time. Most likely he was sent by his boss to go meet with them. So the combination of cyber interference, extremist ties, all led to him being tossed out of the elections. But it did a second thing. It woke up the Romanian population that their democracy truly was under threat. It is a national wake-up call. And that set in the stage exactly what we saw transpire today. Today we saw the Romanian people turn out in large numbers, very large numbers, with a very clear decision. They did not want to have more Russian influence. They wanted to have Nicușor Dan. He's the reform-oriented, independent-aligned, pro-European, pro-Western, pro-NATO leader defeat the challenger, a guy named George Simion. Now, Don himself got 54% of the vote in the final round. And that's not a domestic shift. 54% is a blowaway. When you win that much in a election, 54% is huge. Anything more than 5% is considered to be a landslide. So this is a total rejection of the authoritarianism, a total rejection of all those who are opposed to NATO, opposed to the European Union. It's a message of aligning with Ukraine, aligning with Brussels, and aligning with NATO. Now, in the first round, remember, Simion, the nationalist who got destroyed tonight, Simion had led, and he actually got 41% of the vote. But what's important about that is despite the fact that he did have a lot of support from TikTok, again, there was nothing that showed that he himself was personally involved in that. It looked like it was coming from the outside. Was he aware of that? Not aware of that? Who knows? But those on the outside who are pushing far right and nationalist content were definitely pushing for Simion. What this means in the grand scheme? It means that, well, one, we should definitely be taking a better look at TikTok and what's behind that. That is something that is definitely in the United States, at least, a right-wing talking point, that TikTok deserves greater transparency and deserves a further look as to what happens. but there's definitely something to that Chinese-made product. But further, when we talk about Simion, there's something important here. Simion was somebody who had always been pushing Russian-aligned narratives. So he'd criticized the European Union's sanctions to support Ukraine. He opposed transferring weapons to Ukraine via Romanian territory. He said the typical talking points you hear in Romania, you hear in Slovakia, about the need for national sovereignty, which is really just something that we all know what it really means. That means we don't want to be part of the European Union, and we want to do our own thing, which means we're going to oppose NATO and oppose Ukraine, for instance, being in NATO, or oppose Ukraine being in the European Union. But fortunately, that viewpoint was strongly rejected. Now, what does this mean for the region? Let's look at the neighbors. Let's start with my favorite, Moldova. Iubesc, Moldova. Moldova is a country that about a third of the citizens are Romanians, which means that they're able to vote in the elections. They have the actual passports to vote in the Romanian elections, including the president of Moldova, Maia Sandu, is a citizen of Romania. Now, Simion, by the way, is a side fact, who was the nationalist candidate in Romania. He's actually been banned from entering Moldova for years due to the fact that he's a nationalist and is an extremist who serves a threat to Moldovan national security. Had he won, the diplomatic relationships between Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, and Bucharest, capital of Romania, would have undoubtedly faced a great deal of strain. But since Dan won, that's a huge plus. Dan is somebody who is undoubtedly going to do more to back Moldova's European integration and support the ascension of Moldova into the European Union, and to support little Moldova in opposing the subversion that Russia is trying to push on it day and night. Now, for Ukraine, how will we read these elections? Probably likewise similar matter. I think there's no reason to think otherwise than the fact that Simion would have done more to oppose support for Ukraine. In fact, I think that he would have very well demanded further that Brussels compensate Romania for the previous assistance that had already transferred to Ukraine, that is to ask for money back for earlier assistance for Ukraine. In contrast, the current president, Dan, is a guy who's very clear on Romania's commitments to the larger community, including humanitarian support, military support, intelligence-related support, and he's emphasized the need to support in Ukraine's sovereignty and the importance of the shared security obligations of European countries, namely those of Eastern Europe, of all taking part in stepping up and supporting Ukraine against Russia's illegal invasion. So this strong allegiance to support Ukraine, to support those countries that are opposing Russian aggression, is a strong positive. And that's why I think as a whole, when the European Union looks at this, they'll see it as a huge positive. So Dan is somebody who will definitely push for more European integration. He's definitely not going to be pulling Romania out of the European Union. Quite the opposite. He's somebody who's probably going to be opposing the Eurosceptic blocs of governments in the European Parliament. And he's going to be somebody who's been much more favorable about an enlargement policy that is cohesive and supportive of Moldova and of Ukraine and of others. Now, let's once again look at the flip side. What had happened if Simion had won? I think we're looking at very much a Viktor Orban sort of scenario, or a Fico scenario in Slovakia. He would have been somebody who was very much opposed to any sort of greater integration into European Union, and certainly not into NATO. Versus Dan is somebody who's very interested in the Western Balkans, very interested in Central and Eastern Europe, all being integrated and working closer together. Per NATO, obviously Romania and Ukraine share borders on the Black Sea, and that's where NATO is so important. Dan has proposed increasing actually the Romanians' defense spending by 3.5% of GDP by 2030. Now, keep in mind, 2% is the minimum. Donald Trump has often argued that's too little. By going to 3.5%, it'd be a strong show that obviously Romania is taking its NATO commitments very seriously, and that it's willing to do more about NATO troop deployments as well as troop rotations and being more of that. And also being willing to host, by the way, more infrastructure from NATO and more soldiers from NATO. Dan is somebody very keen to support NATO, support the European Union, support Ukraine, and support Moldova. And ultimately, people in the United States, people in Western Europe should all be happy. I mean, truly, we dodged a bullet by Simion not having been elected. Had he been elected, we would have had isolationist rhetoric met by isolationist actions, withdrawal from the joint security cooperation guarantees. We would have seen increased friction with Moldova. We would have seen a total pullout of support for Ukraine. And we would have also seen adversarial influence within NATO and within Europe, as we're currently seeing from someone like Viktor Orban. He would have been a total drag on the future of the region. So it is a wonderful sign that tonight the Romanians overwhelmingly chose to stick with Europe and chose to stick with the right side of history against the very clear Russian influences. In the end, it's simply that democracy won, the right side of history won, and the domestic populism, the nationalism, the ultranationalism, the disinformation campaigns, they lost. Transparency won, stability won, and sovereignty of Romania won ultimately because of this. Not through the false, empty expressions of it, but those who are truly going to be fighting against destabilization of their own country and fighting against democratic erosion. That's what we saw happen today in Romania. So as we go ahead, it's a great day for Romania and a great day for all of our friends there. Înainte România, spre destinul ta Irena. Wish you all the best. Thank you. And thank you all for supporting Ukraine.